A Kennedy education, the schools that shaped America's most famous family. One Kennedy was expelled from Harvard for cheating. Another challenged segregation at the University of Virginia Law School. JFK arrived at Choate, thin, sickly, and underestimated, then became the leader of a group of boys known as the Muckers. Before the Kennedys became presidents, senators, ambassadors, journalists, and symbols of American glamour, they were students moving through some of the most powerful schools in America. Their education exposes a side of the family that glamour often hides: illness, ambition, Catholic identity, class pressure, rebellion, and the punishing expectations placed on every generation. The same schools appear again and again: Boston Latin, Sacred Heart, Choate, Harvard, Milton, Miss Porter's, Radcliffe, Georgetown, Virginia Law, Brown, and Andover, turning the family's education into its own kind of inheritance. The story begins one generation before Jack, Bobby, and Ted, with two grandfathers who understood how much a school could change the future of a family. Patrick J. Kennedy, 1858 to 1929. Patrick J. Kennedy was born in East Boston in 1858, the son of Irish famine immigrants. His father died during a cholera epidemic before PJ was even a year old. He received a modest Catholic education, worked on the docks, built businesses, and became one of the most important Democratic political figures in East Boston. John F. Honey Fitzgerald, 1863 to 1950. On Rose Kennedy's side was John F. Fitzgerald, better known as Honey Fitz. He was born in Boston's North End in 1863, attended Eliot Grammar, then Boston Latin, and briefly studied at Harvard Medical School before leaving after his father's death. P.J. Kennedy and Honey Fitz never earned college degrees, but they understood what schooling could do. By the time their own children came of age, education had become one of the family's main tools for entering institutions that earlier generations of Irish Catholics had rarely been allowed to touch. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., 1888 to 1969. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. understood that world better than anyone. Joe Kennedy began in parish schools, first Assumption and then Xaverian, before his father sent him across the river to Boston Latin. Founded in 1635, Boston Latin is the oldest public school in America, older than Harvard and older than the United States itself. For P.J. Kennedy, sending his Irish Catholic son there was a statement. Joe was being trained to move among Boston's old elite. He was a middling student, but he was popular, athletic, and ambitious. He was elected class president, became colonel of the cadet regiment, and played baseball. In 1908, he entered Harvard. At Harvard, Joe wanted more than a degree. He joined Hasty Pudding, played baseball, and tried to enter the Porcellian Club, the exclusive final club associated with Boston's oldest families. He was rejected. The slight stayed with him for decades. Joe Kennedy would eventually become one of the richest men in America. He made money in banking, Hollywood, Wall Street, and business. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt named him the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. In 1938, he became ambassador to the court of St. James's, the post he had wanted for years. Still, he never forgot the doors that had remained closed to him. When his own children came along, he made sure they carried credentials no one could easily dismiss. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, 1890 to 1995. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy brought a different kind of education into the family. She wanted to attend Wellesley, but her father refused. Rose later described that lost opportunity as one of the great disappointments of her youth. Instead, she studied within the Sacred Heart system, first in Boston, then in Europe. In 1908, she sailed with her father and sister to Europe and was left at the Blumenthal Academy of the Sacred Heart in Wales, in the Netherlands, near the German border. The school was housed in a former medieval castle and run with the strict formality of the Sacred Heart tradition. She later attended Manhattanville and studied piano at the New England Conservatory of Music. When she married Joe Kennedy in 1914, she brought that Sacred Heart formation into the Kennedy home. She tracked her children's progress carefully, recording their health, exams, schools, and milestones on index cards. For Joe and Rose Kennedy, childhood was organized, measured, and watched. Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., 1915 to 1944. Their first son was Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. From the beginning, Joe Jr. was treated as the future of the family. When he was born in 1915, Honey Fitz reportedly predicted that the child would become the first Catholic president of the United States. From that point on, the family seemed to treat the prediction almost like an assignment. Joe Jr. attended Edward Devotion in Brookline, Noble and Greenough's Lower School, Dexter, and Riverdale Country School after the family moved to New York. In 1929, he went to Choate. At Choate, he fit the image his parents wanted. He played football, worked on the yearbook, and graduated in 1933 with the reputation of a strong all-around student and athlete. Then came the London School of Economics, Harvard, and Harvard Law. When he reached Harvard Law, his education had become preparation for public life. Then came the war. Joe Jr. left law school to fly Navy bombers. He had already flown enough combat missions to come home when he volunteered for Operation Aphrodite, a dangerous secret mission involving explosive-laden aircraft. On August 12, 1944, his plane exploded over eastern England. He was 29. The son raised for the presidency was gone. The family's political hopes shifted toward the second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963. Jack Kennedy never looked like the obvious heir. He was thin, frequently ill, and spent so much time in school infirmaries that classmates sometimes wondered whether he would ever be healthy enough for a demanding career. He began at Edward Devotion in Brookline in 1922, then moved to Noble and Greenough's Lower School, then Dexter, then Riverdale Country School after the family relocated to Bronxville. In 1930, Rose sent him to Canterbury, a Catholic boarding school in Connecticut. Appendicitis brought him home before the year was over. The next fall, he followed Joe Jr. to Choate. At Choate, Jack lived in his brother's shadow. Joe Jr. was stronger, healthier, and more naturally suited to the role their father had imagined. Jack was often sick, often underweight, and often in trouble. Classmates called him Rat Face. His closest friend was Lem Billings, who would remain one of the most important people in his life. Together, they became part of the Choate Muckers Club, a group of boys who took their name from a chapel sermon by headmaster George St. John. St. John had warned against the muckers, the troublesome boys who disrupted school life. Jack and his friends adopted the insult as a badge of honor and had gold shovel pins made with CMC engraved on them. The Muckers Club became one of the defining stories of Jack's school years. He was sickly, mischievous, funny, socially magnetic, and already skilled at turning trouble into charm. One of the most famous Muckers stories involved a firecracker and a toilet seat. in one of the dormitory bathrooms. The prank could have ended with expulsion. Instead, it became part of the legend around Jack Kennedy's schoolboy rebellion. He graduated from Choate in 1935, ranked 64th out of 112, and was voted most likely to succeed. His college years began with false starts. He went to the London School of Economics and became ill within weeks. He tried Princeton and withdrew before Christmas. Finally, in 1936, he entered Harvard. At Harvard, Jack completed what illness had repeatedly interrupted. He wrote a senior thesis on British appeasement that, with help from his father and journalist Arthur Crock, became the best-selling book Why England Slept. The royalties helped him buy a Buick convertible. The boy teased at Choate and doubted because of his health had become a published author before he was 23. Rosemary Kennedy, 1918 to 2005. Rosemary Kennedy's education tells a much sadder story. Born in 1918, Rosemary developed more slowly than her siblings after a difficult birth. The Kennedy household was built around competition, achievement, and public success. Rosemary needed patience, specialized attention, and protection. She attended Edward Devotion, then the neighborhood school in the Bronx, then Marymount Convent in Tarrytown, where the nuns worked with her on reading and arithmetic into her late teens. In 1938, she went to London with her parents. There, at a Montessori school, she experienced what her family later remembered as one of the happiest periods of her life. The structure and method seemed to help her. Then the family returned to America. By 1941, Joe Kennedy had become increasingly concerned about Rosemary's future and behavior. That November, he authorized a prefrontal lobotomy. Rosemary was 23. The operation left her unable to speak in full sentences and unable to walk without assistance. In 1949, she was moved to St. Coletta's in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she lived for the rest of her life in a private cottage on the grounds. Her sister Eunice never forgot her. Rosemary's life became one of the deepest influences behind Eunice's later work with children and adults with intellectual disabilities, including the movement that became the Special Olympics. Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, 1920 to 1948. Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick, had the gift of charm. She began at Riverdale Country, then attended the Convent of the Sacred Heart at Norriton, Connecticut. After that came Holy Child in Neuilly-sur-Seine, outside Paris, and Finch College in New York. Then her father became ambassador to Britain, and Kick entered London society. She dazzled people almost immediately. The London press named her debutante of the year. She fell in love with England, with aristocratic life, and eventually with William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. He was Protestant. Rose Kennedy was horrified. Kick married him in a civil ceremony in London in May 1944. Rose refused to attend. 4 months later, Hartington was killed by a sniper in Belgium. Kick was a widow at 24. In 1948, she died in a plane crash in France at 28. She was buried in the Cavendish family churchyard at Edensor near Chatsworth, far from the Kennedy family plots and the world that had raised her. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, 1921 to 2009. Eunice Kennedy's education helped shape one of the most consequential public lives in the family. She attended the neighborhood school in the Bronx, the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Manhattan, and Sacred Heart at Roehampton in London. She entered Manhattanville in 1939, transferred to Stanford in 1941, and graduated in 1943 with a degree in sociology. Eunice had the Kennedy competitiveness, but she directed it toward social reform. She worked with the Justice Department's Juvenile Delinquency Office and at the House of the Good Shepherd in Chicago. Then she began redirecting the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation toward intellectual disability. In the summer of 1962, she opened Camp Shriver on the lawn of her Maryland home, Timberlawn. About 35 children attended. Local teenagers served as counselors. That small summer camp became the beginning of the Special Olympics. Patricia Kennedy Lawford, 1924 to 2006. Patricia Kennedy followed the Sacred Heart path as well. She attended Sacred Heart in New York, Roehampton in London, and Rosemont College outside Philadelphia. In 1954, she married British actor Peter Lawford. Lawford became part of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack, and the Lawford Beach House in Santa Monica became the Kennedy family's West Coast gathering place. JFK stayed there during the 1960 campaign. Marilyn Monroe spent time there near the end of her life. Pat later divorced Lawford and lived much of her later life away from the family's political center. Robert F. Kennedy, 1925 to 1968. Robert F. Kennedy's schooling was scattered, but the most revealing part of his education came at Virginia Law. Before that, Bobby had attended Riverdale Country, Gibbs School in London, St. Paul's in New Hampshire, Portsmouth Priory in Rhode Island, and Milton Academy outside Boston. At St. Paul's, Rose withdrew him after only a short time because the school's Episcopal chapel made her uncomfortable. Portsmouth Priory was more Catholic. Milton was less so, but Joe Kennedy considered it more academically serious. Bobby graduated from Milton in 1944, served in the Naval Reserve, returned to Harvard in 1946, and graduated in 1948. Then came the University of Virginia Law School. While studying there, Bobby became president of the Student Legal Forum. In 1951, he invited Ralph Bunche to speak. Bunche was a United Nations diplomat and, in 1950, had become the first African American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Bunche agreed to come on one condition: the audience had to be integrated. Virginia's rules did not allow that. Bobby fought the issue all the way up to the university president and won. On March 26, 1951, Ralph Bunche spoke in an integrated Cabell Hall. 2 months after the Bunche event, Bobby married Ethel Skakel in Greenwich, Connecticut. They would have 11 children: Jean Kennedy Smith, 1928 to 2020. Jean Kennedy, the youngest daughter, moved through 3 Sacred Heart schools: Maplehurst in the Bronx, Torresdale outside Philadelphia, and Norriton in Connecticut. She finished at Manhattanville in 1949. In 1956, she married Stephen Smith, who would manage the Kennedy family's business affairs for decades. Long after her brothers were gone, Jean entered public life in her own right. In 1993, she became United States Ambassador to Ireland, where she became connected to the peace process that led toward the Good Friday Agreement. Edward Ted Kennedy, 1932 to 2009. Then came Ted Kennedy, the youngest of Joe and Rose's 9 children. Among Joe and Rose Kennedy's children, Ted became the one expelled from Harvard. During his freshman year, he arranged for another student to take his Spanish examination in his place. Both students were caught. Both were expelled. For a family that treated education as a matter of destiny, the scandal was humiliating. Ted's early schooling had already been unusually disrupted. He attended Gibbs in London, Lawrence Park in Bronxville, Portsmouth Priory, Riverdale Country, Graham X in Florida, Fessenden in Massachusetts, and Cranwell in Lenox. In 1946, he entered Milton Academy, where Bobby had gone. After his expulsion from Harvard, Ted served in the Army in Europe. He returned to Harvard in 1953, graduated in 1956, and went on to the University of Virginia Law School, finishing in 1959. 3 years later, at 30, he won his brother Jack's old Senate seat from Massachusetts. He held it for 47 years. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929 to 1994. Then came the woman whose education would help shape the image of the Kennedy White House more than almost anyone expected. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy entered the family by marriage, but her schooling is one of the most revealing in the Kennedy world. Long before she became First Lady, Jackie Bouvier had already developed a reputation for intelligence, wit, independence, and occasional stubbornness. She began at Miss Chapin's school on East End Avenue in Manhattan. She stayed there for 7 years. At one point, she received a D in conduct after behavior in geography class became so disruptive that the headmistress said she had to be removed from the room. Jackie was spirited, observant, and difficult to place inside the narrow expectations of a young society girl. After her mother married Hugh D. Auchincloss, Jackie attended Holton Arms in Washington from 1942 to 1944. Then she chose Miss Porter's in Farmington, Connecticut, partly because it prepared girls seriously for college. At Miss Porter's, Jackie's gifts became clearer. She graduated in 1947 with the Maria McKinney Memorial Award for Excellence in Literature. Her yearbook praised her wit, her horsemanship, and her reluctance to become a conventional housewife. She wanted to attend Sarah Lawrence. Her parents sent her to Vassar. She spent 2 unhappy years there, often taking the train to Manhattan on weekends. Then she persuaded her family to let her spend her junior year in France through a Smith College program. She studied first at the University of Grenoble, then at the Sorbonne in Paris. She lived with the Durenti family at 76 Avenue Mozart in the 16th arrondissement. Jackie later wrote that she loved that year more than any year of her life. France awakened in her a hunger for knowledge she had previously tried to hide. She did not return to Vassar. Instead, she finished her degree at George Washington University, graduating in 1951 with a B.A. in French literature. That same year, she won Vogue's Prix de Paris, a prestigious editorial fellowship that would have placed her at the magazine for a year, divided between Paris and New York. Her stepfather urged her to turn it down. So Jackie stayed in Washington and became the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald, stopping strangers on the street and asking them questions for the newspaper. In May 1952, at a dinner party in Georgetown, she met Congressman John F. Kennedy. The next generation inherited famous schools, public expectations, and a surname that made ordinary childhood almost impossible. Caroline Kennedy, born 1957. Caroline Kennedy began at the Convent of the Sacred Heart on East 91st Street in New York, the same school tradition that had shaped her grandmother and several of her aunts. She later attended the Brearley School, then Concord Academy in Massachusetts, graduating in 1975. After Concord, she spent a year in London at Sotheby's Institute of Art, then entered Radcliffe, where she studied fine arts and graduated in 1980. She later attended Columbia Law School. edited books and poetry collections, and served as ambassador to Japan and ambassador to Australia. John F. Kennedy, Jr., 1960 to 1999. Few Kennedy children grew up under greater public attention than John F. Kennedy, Jr. The image of him as a 3-year-old saluting his father's coffin became one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. From that moment on, his life unfolded under national fascination. John attended St. David's, the Catholic boys' school on East 89th Street, then the collegiate school on West 77th Street. He later transferred to Phillips Academy in Andover, graduating in 1979. At Brown, he finally had something closer to ordinary college life. He majored in American history, joined Phi Kappa Psi, played rugby, and acted in student productions, including The Playboy of the Western World, The Tempest, and Short Eyes. He lived first in a dorm, then in the Phi Kappa Psi fraternity house. By junior year, he had moved into a house on Benefit Street with 4 roommates, who at different points included Christiane Amanpour, long before she became one of the most recognizable correspondents in the world. His interest in acting gave his college years another dimension. After one student production, a classmate later remembered being invited to a closing night cast party at John's Benefit Street apartment. The place was unexpectedly polished, with matching tasteful furnishings, a small detail that set him apart from the usual image of a careless college boy. Even at Brown, where he could blend in more easily than almost anywhere else, John Kennedy Jr. still carried a kind of inherited elegance. Then came NYU Law, where he finished in 1989. After law school, John faced a public embarrassment most young lawyers would have endured privately. He failed the New York bar exam twice. The tabloids treated each failure as proof that the golden boy was less golden than he looked. John kept taking it, and in July 1990, he passed on his 3rd attempt. By then, the public's attention had become almost impossible to separate from his actual life. People magazine named him Sexiest Man Alive in 1988. He worked as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan under Robert Morgenthau, handling ordinary cases where his last name could get attention, but the courtroom still demanded real work. In 1995, John founded George Magazine with Michael Berman. The idea was bold. Politics presented with the glamour, photography, and celebrity energy of a glossy magazine. At the launch, he joked that he had not seen so many reporters gathered since he failed his first bar exam. The first issue made the concept impossible to miss. Cindy Crawford dressed as George Washington. In 1996, he married Carolyn Bessette on Cumberland Island, Georgia. 3 years later, on July 16, 1999, John, Carolyn, and Carolyn's sister Lauren died in a plane crash off Martha's Vineyard. By the 3rd generation, the Kennedy school pattern had spread across nearly every branch of the family. Bobby and Ethel Kennedy's children began at Our Lady of Victory in McLean, Virginia, the Catholic parish school that became their childhood anchor. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, born 1951. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend went on to the Putney School, Radcliffe, and the University of New Mexico School of Law, before becoming Maryland's first female lieutenant governor in 1994. Joseph P. Kennedy II, born 1952. Joseph P. Kennedy II moved through Sidwell Friends, boarding schools, and UMass Boston before founding Citizens Energy Corporation and later serving 6 terms in Congress from the Massachusetts district once held by his Uncle Jack. Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. born 1954. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. passed through Georgetown Prep, the Millbrook School in Dutchess County, Harvard, the London School of Economics, UVA Law, and Pace. Millbrook had a working zoo on campus, the Trevor Zoo, which suited his early interest in animals and the outdoors. Patrick J. Kennedy, born 1967. Patrick J. Kennedy went from Phillips Academy in Andover to Providence College, then to the Rhode Island Legislature at 21 and Congress at 27. Maria Shriver, born 1955. Maria Shriver carried Sacred Heart into Stone Ridge, then Georgetown and television journalism. Timothy Shriver, born 1959. Timothy Shriver went from St. Albans to Yale and eventually led the Special Olympics. Christopher Kennedy Lawford, 1955 to 2018. Christopher Kennedy Lawford moved through Middlesex, Tufts, Georgetown, and Boston College Law before becoming an actor and recovery advocate. The schools kept repeating: Catholic schools, elite prep schools, Harvard, Georgetown, Virginia Law, Brown, Radcliffe, Andover. The pattern kept expanding, and so did the pressure. In the end, the Kennedy story can be traced through its schools almost as clearly as through its elections, weddings, scandals, and funerals. Boston Latin opened the door to Old Boston. Sacred Heart carried Rose's Catholic formation into her daughters and granddaughters. Choate gave Jack Kennedy the Muckers Club, Lem Billings, and a reputation for charm under pressure. Harvard remained the credential Joe Kennedy wanted for his sons, even after it rejected him socially and humiliated Ted academically. Some became presidents, senators, ambassadors, journalists, lawyers, and activists. Some died before they reached the futures planned for them. Others spent their lives trying to live beyond the pressure of the Kennedy name. For the Kennedys, schools were gateways, tests, battlegrounds, and warnings. Before the White House, the Senate campaigns, and Hyannisport, there were classrooms, failed exams, school scandals, dormitory friendships, and young people trying to survive a name that demanded almost everything. That was the Kennedy education.
Thank you everyone so much for watching Cultured Elegance. If you'd love to support the channel, you can become a channel member today by clicking join at the bottom of the screen. Thank you everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.